acclaimed, world-renowned sociologist and professor emeritus at Berkeley, Dr. Harry Edwards. Start with you, Dr. Edwards. I believe this is your 5th viewing of Lynch, A History. How did this one hit you compared to the previous 4 times you saw it?
Yeah, this is the fifth time I've seen this film, and I've never seen the same film twice, because this is, if you really look at it, it's really not a documentary. It's a jazz suite, and it's like listening to John Coltrane and those sheets of sound. You can pick up on one theme at the beginning and follow it all the way through. Whether it's the anger, whether it's the media, whether it's even the silence. I mean, it's like I grew up in East St. Louis, about a mile from Miles Davis. So I was into the music early on, and I began to make comparisons between the music and sport. I remember a situation where Miles was at a concert, a piece that ran about 8.5 minutes, and he came out and played about 6 notes, you know, and a reporter asked him afterwards, he said, "Miles, why'd you play so sparsely? You know, I mean, you played about 6 or 7 notes." And Miles looked at him and said, "Well, you just don't understand. The silence is a note too." You know, so when you look at this film and you see all of the times, I mean, just follow the silence through, and you find that Marshawn is not alone. I mean, they're being stiffed by white coaches. They're being stiffed by other black athletes, but it's the black athletes who become controversial once they do that. And what we have to understand is that this goes all the way back to our first origins on this continent. Black people have never been perceived as creditable witnesses to their own experiences and outcomes. And this goes all the way back to slavery. So when the slave master says, "My slaves are happy," and the slaves say, "We want to be free," guess who they believe? And so that plays right on up through today. You have film of this cop shooting this man in the back, running away, and nobody is charged and so forth, because they take the cop's word for it, even though they're sitting there looking at the tape, and they'll come up with something so outlandish as, "You don't know what happened before the tape started, and you don't know what happened after the tape was cut off," and there's the man laying on the ground dead. So again, you have that situation. The other thing we have to use to put this in context is the whole decision of Plessy versus Ferguson. People think that Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which established segregation, was about separate but equal. That concept is nowhere in the decision. Plessy versus Ferguson, as John Harlan, the only Supreme Court justice who did not vote for it, was about pushing black people back as close as possible, as close to the subjugation, submission, and segregation, subsistence of slavery as possible, without calling it that. And this thing of separate but equal was something that evolved later on. They wanted black people back as close to slavery as possible. That's what the Supreme Court put in action. And so when you look at it from that perspective, you realize this parallel development of institutions, businesses, schools, hospitals, cultural and civic organizations. The Negro Leagues was a resistance movement. And of course you get down to individuals such as Jack Johnson, who simply refused to be contained. That's who I would really compare Marshawn to, is Jack Johnson. Refused to be contained, confined, constricted, consigned. He wanted to be free. Jack Johnson in 1909 walked into a hotel in St. Louis that was totally segregated. He walked up and said, "I want a room." The man told him, "We don't serve your kind." He said, "Well, you don't understand. It's not for me. It's for my lady, and she's your kind." Of course, they marched him right on out into the street. But he wanted it all. He refused to be constrained. And so as I look at Marshawn, one of my guys from Cal, who refused to be constrained in any dimension of his life. So as I look at this fifth showing for me, I see a different film still, in the same way that I listen to John Coltrane playing my favorite things, and depending on what mood I'm in and what I'm looking for and what I'm hearing, I hear an entirely different thing than I've heard a dozen times before in listening to that piece. So you have to look at this in terms of all of the themes. You can't just look at it as a documentary film. Now, I don't know what my brother here set out to do, but as Miles used to say, we may not have done what we practiced and intended to do, but what we did turned out all right. So that's
David,
what I'd say here.
David, I imagine, I'll give you a second and I'll kind of extend this question because you might be speechless right now. To hear the godfather of modern protests.
To die and go to heaven.
Yeah, what do you feel hearing that from Dr. Edwards?
Well, I mean, he's the man who I was, a 13-year-old kid growing up in the Bay Area, little 5'4" point guard for Aragon High School in San Mateo, and I read Dr. Edwards' book, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, and I saw a way to connect my parents' politics and my sports playing, and I've spent the last 50 years trying to connect my interest in sports with the wide world of politics, and it's just credible consummation of my life to be sharing this stage and to make a film that tries to explore all those connected threads. So this is really a consummation of my life, but as Dr. Edwards said, this is just the beginning of the conversation. But I mean, he's the person who, to my eyes and ears, created the field of seeing the theater of American sports as not only a revelation of the American character, but as a crucial incubator to make the culture better. There's this interesting ways in which American sports have pushed the culture forward. There are ways in which sports are behind the times, but there are also ways, whether it's Jackie Robinson, Kurt Flood, Ali, etc., in which black athletes have actually moved the culture forward, and I would argue Marshawn Lynch definitely does that.
At the time, though, and it just seemed like not a lot of people got that. It seemed like this defiance, this act of defiance by Marshawn was being viewed through the prism of either petulance or unprofessionalism, not as a continuation of the tradition of protest. Why did so many people miss what Marshawn was doing?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to understand is that part of the oppression is to keep people ignorant of and not being able to even articulate their own experiences. And so when we go back and look at a Jack Johnson, a lot of black people did not understand Jack Johnson and considered him an embarrassment. They did not support the Negro Leagues after the locker rooms of Major League Baseball was integrated. So in 1946, the Brooklyn Dodgers signed Jackie Robinson. By the time Jackie Robinson retired in 1956, the Negro Leagues had all but completely and totally collapsed because black people wanted to go and see athletes play in this Major League Baseball because they were essentially ignorant of what it was that had evolved, the fact that the Negro Leagues was a resistance movement, and the fact that that movement, that struggle continued, because one of the things that we know is that our circumstances are dynamic and diverse. Our struggle, therefore, has to be multifaceted and perpetual, including sports, and there are no final victories. So you don't just give up those things that you've developed and put together as a resistance movement simply because somebody decides that it is in their interest to tap an untapped pool of black athletic talent owing to a manpower shortage coming out of World War II. And that's what we gave up. So that ignorance has been consistent. There are black people who fell for this nonsense that Colin Kaepernick's taking a knee was against the military and the flag. It had nothing to do with the military and the
I don't know how
flag.
many times he had said it.
Oh man, I mean, I don't know of a single athlete who was protesting who said, I'm doing this in protest of the flag or in protest of the anthem, although they would be within their rights. The reality is that was a ruse, a red herring, drug across the trail to keep people ignorant about what was really going on. And then when you look at them talking about patriotism, and they got this guy sitting in the White House. Now, I don't know what this man is. I mean, he's been called a moron, an idiot, a misogynist, a racist, a xenophobic, pathological liar, and a morally malignant degenerate. I don't know if he's all of that. But I'll tell you one thing, he will most certainly do until the real thing comes along. So how they can tolerate that and then say a black man who takes a knee in protest of 147 black men, women, and children being shot down every year, most of them unarmed under cover of the badge, is somehow being unpatriotic, tells you how sick this society is.
Yes.
We need to at least understand our circumstances, even if we determine that there may not be too much we can do about it. We can be honest even when we're not right. And that means looking at these circumstances and not falling for the rope-a-dope that somehow these guys are unpatriotic or they're sacrificing their money or their career for nothing, as was stated by a couple of black reporters up here on this screen. That is historic and traditional, and it's part of the game that they run on us.
Yeah, that's what I was like. Personally, to make it personal, I couldn't help but be just kind of like sickened by this institution that I'm a part of. Like, thankfully, you know, my sensibilities did not align with some of the people that made this film. But I wanted to get to that. The media, the mainstream American media, as this agent of this system of oppression. Like, what's the message to the consumer, Dr. Edwards, of mainstream media to avoid having the okie doke run on them when it comes to protests right before them? A Marshawn Lynch, you know, daring to, I love how you use, David, I love how you use Ebro Darden's drop about 5 times. You move around here like you're a free man. A guy daring to be a free man, exactly, and operate by his own rules. How does the consumer of mass media avoid being taken along that ride that you're talking about, the part of this tradition, Dr. Edwards?
Well, you can't, you know, when they turn on the news on cable, and you read the credits and it says edited and produced, your first question should be by whom?
Yes.
And toward what end? When you pick up the newspaper and it says all the news that's fit to print, and you look in there and you can't even find a picture of a black person that's not in trouble. Why is what's going on in my community, what our concerns are, what I'm trying to do through my church or in my community, why is that not fit to print in the newspaper that's delivered in my town? And so you have to understand that the media is the only institution that is covered as absolutely imperative within the Constitution, a free press. And you have to wonder, what does free mean to those men who wrote the Constitution, who held my ancestors in slavery? And that situation has not substantially changed.